So, you've probably seen this floating around online, right? Maybe in a meme or some deep dive forum post. The idea that just two companies, BlackRock and Vanguard, secretly own, well, pretty much everything. It sounds like something straight out of a conspiracy thriller. But is it? Is there any truth to it? Let's dig in and find out what's really going on.
And a lot of the time, the conversation kicks off with something exactly like this. A Reddit post claiming these two firms have controlling shares in basically every company in the US. And you can see why this gets so much traction, right? It sparks these huge debates about power, control, and how our entire economy is wired. But before we can even figure out if it's true, we need to get our heads around the sheer scale we're talking about.
Yeah, you heard that right, $20 trillion. That's the rough combined total of all the assets that BlackRock and Vanguard are managing for their clients. I mean, to put that into perspective, that's more the entire yearly economic output of the United States. A number that big, it's just staggering. It definitely makes you wonder, okay, how on earth did two firms get so massive?
Right, so this didn't just happen overnight. This whole situation is the result of a quiet but absolutely massive revolution in the way we all invest. A revolution that, it turns out, created the perfect storm for these giants to rise.
For a long time, if you wanted to invest, you bought stocks in companies you liked. Simple. But that has completely changed. This OECD report points out that back in the 60s, a whopping 84% of US stocks were owned directly by people like you and me. But by 2011, that number had plummeted to just 40%. So what happened? Well, instead of picking individual stocks, more and more of us started pooling our money into these huge funds, all thanks to a powerful new way of thinking.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it all comes down to two totally different strategies. You've got active investing, which is all about trying to be the smartest person in the room, picking the winners, dodging the losers, all to try and beat the market. Then there's passive investing. And passive investing basically says, hold on, why try to beat the market when you can just be the market? These passive funds, they just buy a tiny slice of everything in a big index, like the S&P 500. The goal isn't to be a genius, it's just to match the market's performance and do it for super, super cheap.
And when it comes to this whole passive investing world, there are three undisputed kings. We talk a lot about BlackRock and Vanguard, and for good reason, but you absolutely have to include State Street in the mix. Together, they are the big three. They manage an absolutely massive chunk of all these index funds around the globe.
And this chart from the OECD, wow, it shows you exactly what happened next. See this? The number of US companies that share the same big institutional owner has just skyrocketed. Back in 1980, it was pretty rare. By 2014, it became the new normal. And this creates a really fascinating and kind of tricky economic puzzle.
So, this is the big question, right? What happens when companies that are supposed to be fighting tooth and nail against each other are all owned by the same few investors? This is where the real concern starts to creep in. Okay, so the fancy term for this is common ownership. It's a little different than what you might think. It's not that one company owns its competitor, it's that a third party, one of these huge investment firms, owns a big piece of all of them. And here's a perfect real-world example. Just look at this table from that same OECD report. It's pretty wild. This is the US airline industry, and you see the same names popping up again and again. BlackRock and Vanguard, top shareholders in Delta, Southwest, and American. I mean, think about that for a second. These are the companies that are supposed to be in a brutal price war for your business, but their biggest owners are basically sitting on all sides of the chessboard at once.
And that brings us to the billion-dollar question, or I guess the trillion-dollar question. If you own a huge chunk of every major airline, do you really want them to have a vicious price war? I mean, sure, it might help one of them win for a little while, but it's going to hurt the others, and your overall portfolio would take a hit. From your perspective as the common owner, wouldn't the best thing be for them to, maybe not compete quite so hard, keep prices nice and stable, keep the whole industry profitable? And that's exactly what economists are worried about, this idea that competition might be getting watered down.
Okay, so we've established a potential motive for them to want less competition. But here's the key. Do they actually have the power to influence these companies, or are they just sitting on the sidelines? This is really the heart of the whole debate.
Well, according to researchers, they've got a few major levers they can pull. First, and this is the big one, voting power. When you own 5–10% of a company, your vote at a shareholder meeting is a huge deal. Second, they have direct access. We're talking private meetings between their teams and the C-suite of these companies. And third, they can influence who gets paid what and how. They vote on executive pay packages, and they could, in theory, reward managers for keeping the whole industry healthy, not just for crushing their rivals.
Now, of course, there's another side to the story. The argument for passivity is pretty simple. Look, these are passive funds. Their whole business model is about tracking an index at a super low cost, not micromanaging thousands of different companies. Plus, they have a legal duty, a fiduciary duty, to act in the best interest of each individual company, which should, in theory, stop them from hurting one to help another.
But, like another really sharp Reddit user pointed out, passive investing doesn't necessarily mean they're silent. And it turns out there's a lot of evidence to back that up.
The thing is, both BlackRock and Vanguard have these huge teams called investment stewardship teams, and these guys are anything but passive. Their entire job is to talk to the companies they invest in, to vote on major issues, to influence who sits on the board, and to shape long-term strategy. They're very open about this. They see it as a key part of their job.
So, if this is a real thing, with real economic consequences, what, if anything, should be done about it? And this is where it gets really complicated, because there's no easy answer. This is a live, ongoing challenge for regulators all over the world.
So what are some of the options on the table? That OECD report lays out a few of the main ideas people are debating. First, some say we should just use the antitrust laws we already have, but maybe more aggressively. Another idea is to set hard limits, like saying one investment firm can't own more than, say, 1% of an entire market. And a third option is to create safe harbors, basically saying if you own less than a certain amount, say 15%, you're considered not a threat to competition.
But, and this is a huge but, none of these are a magic bullet. Every single one of these options has major risks. If you regulate too heavily, you could mess with the stock market and hurt the low-cost retirement funds that millions of us depend on. But if you do too little, you might not solve the problem at all.
So let's circle back to where we started. Do BlackRock and Vanguard secretly own the world? Well, no, not in the simple way that a meme might suggest. But their unique position, as these massive, common owners of so many competing companies, raises a really deep and kind of troubling question. When the biggest investors own the entire market, who are companies really competing for? Is it for you and me, the customers? Or is it for the approval of that handful of giant shareholders, who, in a way, own the whole game? It's a question that makes you rethink the very definition of competition.